There's one thing that stops 99% of people from working hard and performing optimally, and that thing is burnout. Most people don't know that burnout is 100% solvable when you understand the underlying neuroscience. And what's more, there's a way to structure your life and day such that no matter how hard you push and how high you perform, burnout becomes an impossibility. Now, I'm Rian, co-founder and CEO of the Flow Research Collective, and along with my partner, Steven Kotler, we've taught thousands of professionals how to access flow states at will. Now, you know that state where you feel lethargic yet agitated, feeling cornered by life. Tasks that once fired you up now feel like chores. Your self-belief tanks, you're worn out and even cynical. 6 cups of coffee barely make a dent in the bone-deep exhaustion you feel. Now, this isn't depression, it's something different, but it's messing with your life and strangleholding your ambition. So what's going on here? Well, the real problem is something the psychologist Herbert Freudenberger discovered in the 1970s. At a busy and free healthcare clinic in New York City, volunteers arrived early to help the underserved and the poor out of the goodness of their hearts. Long hours didn't faze them because the work was so rewarding. But over time, the once lively volunteers started to slowly drift into resentment. Their empathy started to evaporate and it was replaced by detachment. And this trend started to spread through the understaffed clinic, threatening to deprive patients of much needed care. Freudenberger began to notice this change. But what's weird was that these healthcare volunteers weren't depressed. Freudenberger realized he was witnessing a unique phenomenon. This wasn't just fatigue or a temporary lapse in morale, it was a profound motivational collapse and emotional void. And that's when Freudenberger coined a term, burnout. My first brush with burnout happened as a teenager. I grew up in Ireland, dreaming of one day making it here to the US to make it big, and I just needed to get my foot in the door with an internship in the US so I could land an American work visa and get to the promised land. During college, I applied widely. Out of hundreds of applicants, I looked out and landed a gig at a company here in California. Now, the internship started out exciting. I was working alongside well-known professionals I had long admired, but within weeks, the shine started to wear off a little bit. My pay was the equivalent of minimum wage, and I had to squander half of what I was earning just on Uber to get to and from the office. Making matters worse, the company culture turned out to be toxic. Leadership gossiped, and most of the work that I produced ended up being scrapped, with less high quality work produced by others being used for political reasons alone. Over time, I started to lose belief in my own ability to perform. I was deep in the throes of burnout. Burnout isn't mere fatigue or temporary stress. Burnout is a recognized and distinct medical disorder. Once you understand the characteristics of burnout and its causes, you'll also know whether you are at risk of it, how to eliminate it, and how to guard yourself from experiencing it in the first place. There's 3 things that make burnout distinct, and those are exhaustion, cynicism, and low self-efficacy. You can almost think of burnout as the opposite of flow. Flow being that optimal state of consciousness where we feel our best and we perform our best. In flow, you're deeply engrossed in your task. You lose track of time and you feel a sense of mastery and control. On the other hand, with burnout, you feel as if you're just going through the motions. Time drags on. Flow compounds gains, burnout compounds losses. And this is what it felt like during the internship. I started glancing at the clock, wishing the day would end so I could get the hell out of there. My work felt increasingly pointless, and the effects of burnout aren't just subjective or psychological. Burnout actually alters your neural circuitry, forcing a downward spiral of cognitive dysfunction. I didn't know it at the time, but several things were happening to my brain while I was experiencing this burnout. The first is that burnout actually enlarges your amygdala and weakens its connections with the anterior cingulate and medial prefrontal cortex. Individuals with burnout are more prone to emotional and attentional lapses, and it's harder for the brain to rein in and control those negative emotions. To put it another way, burnout does to the mind what a bad cold does to the body. Once I realized that this is what I was dealing with, I took a week off, tried to relax by the beach a little bit to recover because I had to get back on my game fast. But when I returned, although I felt good for a day or two, within a week, I felt just as flat as before. So what on earth was happening here? Why didn't taking a week off work reduce the burnout I was experiencing? Well, years later, I came across the research of pioneering psychologist Christina Maslach. Maslach developed the Maslach Burnout Inventory, the most widely used instrument for assessing burnout in the scientific community. And Maslach discovered that, like flow, burnout actually has validated preconditions. The 6 burnout triggers from Christina Maslach's research are as follows. First off, you've got lack of control. This is where you lack autonomy, ownership, or creative expression. Maybe you feel micromanaged. Second, there's values conflict, where there's a disconnect between you and your organization's core values. Maybe you care about the planet, but your company dumps trash into the nearby river. The next burnout trigger is insufficient reward. You feel taken for granted, unrecognized, or undercompensated. Then we've got work overload. Your workload is simply too high, too complex, or everything just is too urgent. The next trigger for burnout is unfairness. Maybe there's a culture of favoritism, like in my instance in LA, where your boss promotes their cousin instead of you, even though you were the one who actually earned the role. Finally, the sixth burnout trigger is a breakdown of community. This is where you have to work with patronizing, low-performing colleagues with no mechanism for healthy conflict resolution or feedback. Now, after I learned about the burnout triggers, the reason for the unresolved burnout when I was interning in LA finally started to click. Lack of control, unfairness, and insufficient reward. Ironically, one of the ones I was least susceptible to was actually work overload. I wasn't actually having to work too much during the internship. This brings us to an essential key for tackling burnout. You have to solve the root problem to solve the burnout problem. That means isolating the offending burnout triggers within your workplace and then fully addressing each of them. And you don't want to make the mistake most people make, which is assuming that all of their burnout is just from that one work overload trigger. So many people do what I did. They take a little bit of time off, they come back, boom, they're burnt out again. And the reason is they're susceptible to other burnout triggers. So we've got to address them all. And even better, prevent it from creeping in the first place. So let's cover 5 neuroscience-based protocols to alleviate any current burnout in your system and buffer yourself against burnout over the long term. The first burnout proofing protocol is to choose the right kind of hard. This is how you combat the insidious burnout trigger of insufficient reward. After years of striving toward a PhD, I finally entered my dream PhD program. 3 years delving deep into research on something called effective altruism, a form of moral philosophy that's very quantitative and mathematical. Now, shortly after beginning this PhD, a nightmare started to unfold. Whenever I sat down to work on it, I was completely paralyzed, stuck endlessly in the struggle phase of flow. Even getting a basic outline for the essay took me weeks of painful, laborious work. And the essay ended up being kind of crappy. At best, I strained intensely to improve the essay from very bad to slightly below average. And this created insufficient reward for the effort that I was exerting. But no matter how hard I pushed, my output was just flatlining. Now, why was this? Well, it turned out I was simply studying the wrong domain. I was forcing myself into the wrong kind of hard. The effective altruism research completely misaligned with my intrinsic strengths. It required advanced quantitative skills, not my forte as more of a conceptual thinker. Plus, the pursuit was extrinsically motivated. I wouldn't normally read this stuff out of pure curiosity in my free time. So I redirected my research toward flow and moral philosophy. Playing to my strengths changed everything. Now I could work productively for hours on my PhD with an incomparably low level of stress. I created the outline for this essay in a fraction of the time and was able to spend the extra hours getting it from a 9 to a 10 out of 10. So the right kind of hard, like in this example, has a few characteristics. First, it comes with sufficient, not insufficient reward. This means you put a few hours in and you get a fairly big bang for your buck in return. You can think of this as getting a good ROI on difficulty. If the effort to reward ratio is way off, on the other hand, where you're putting in a ton of effort but getting hardly anything back in return, like I was with those painful philosophy essays, then you risk burning out. Second, the right kind of hard is fueled by intrinsic rather than extrinsic motivation. Potent intrinsic motivators include curiosity, mastery, autotelicity, purpose, autonomy, and relatedness. When intrinsic motivators are present, we get more flow state. Suddenly, hard work feels easy and even effortless. The right kind of hard aligns with your strengths because you're naturally good at it. You're able to gain momentum and traction fast. And finally, with the right kind of hard, you want most of the challenge to be tilted toward the upper end of a task or project. You don't want to be putting all your effort in to get it from 0 to good. Taking that thing from good to great tests the upper limits of our abilities, hooks our attention and drives flow via the challenge skills balance. Think about a pro athlete fine-tuning their form to shave milliseconds off a race time, as opposed to a novice trying to master the basic rules without making any progress. To beat burnout, pick a hard that hooks you. Now, our second burnout proofing protocol is called Don't Stay Too Close to the Line. Back in Ireland, I was convinced the key to success was redlining daily. White knuckling, grinding at 100% intensity and speed. I'd guzzle coffee to power through 16-hour workdays, determined to squeeze out every last drop of productivity possible. Redlining, sometimes it even feels great. You're cruising, crushing it, and you want to keep on pushing for more and more and more. For me, a few months after doing this, the cracks began to emerge. My mind grew foggy with each task requiring more effort. Still, I clung to the red line, terrified that if I eased up, I'd lose my edge and it would kill my output, performance, and momentum. Until late one night, spent and bleary, I finally hit the wall. My energy had flatlined. I then struggled to work at all for weeks. I ended up losing way more momentum by being forced out of the game than whatever productivity loss would have come from just dialing back the game proactively, running at 80% intensity and speed rather than doing what I did and running at 110%. Because sustainable effort beats an endless sprint every time. Burnout comes from operating too close to the top of your capacity for too long. You cross an invisible line where motivation evaporates. This line is called the allostatic load limit. Allostatic load referring to the wear and tear that your body and brain incur from daily work and activity. If you cross the allostatic load limit and you stay there for too long, suddenly the burnout symptoms creep in. The simplest tasks turn exhausting. Just imagine your capacity is a 200-pound squat. You rarely want to max that out. You want to train by squatting about 80% of that, 160 pounds routinely instead. Exceeding your maximum day after day guarantees eventual injury, forcing you out of the game, resulting in decreased aggregate productivity. A mentor once suggested that I start tracking my daily capacity on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being right up at that allostatic load limit and 1 being the other end of the spectrum. This simple hack reveals when you are near your limits, signaling the need to dial it back just a bit in advance so you can stay in the game and keep on pushing, rather than getting kicked out by virtue of overdoing it. So if you're getting up to an 8 or a 9 out of 10 or higher consistently, you likely want to dial it back just a bit. Objective markers like heart rate variability can also help you gauge capacity. Now, the third burnout proofing protocol is called When You See a Hill, Sprint. Here's the nuance. Other times, instead of leaning back, leaning in is actually the solution to the burnout. You can strategically nudge past carefully the allostatic load limit to cure your burnout. That's right, in certain situations, you can actually work yourself out of burnout. If you're feeling overwhelmed by a fairly hefty workload, but you're getting kind of mediocre average results, paradoxically, in certain instances, assuming you're not falling for the wrong kind of hard, you can dial the workload up to a higher level, to an extreme level in certain cases, if that's going to result in a big uptick in the results and momentum and traction you're able to produce, enough to combat the burnout trigger of insufficient reward. This will energize you and blunt the burnout even though you're actually dialing up your work. That's because one of the best buffers against burnout is winning, getting results, seeing traction for the effort you're exerting. You rarely hear about startup founders like Zuckerberg or Bill Gates building rapidly these billion-dollar companies that have incredible momentum and getting burned out while doing it, even though they're working hundreds of hours a week endlessly. That's because the success they're having is fuel. The success blunts the burnout. So stacking wins like this result in dopamine. Dopamine results in focused attention, which results in increased access to flow state, that peak performance state, which results in more and more wins. When we continue to ride this cycle, we build momentum. The key is to do this within a limited timeline or window, and remind yourself that you only have to do it for a short while, a week, a month, a year, and then everything will change. The principle, the motto, the thing to tattoo on your forehead for this is, when you see a hill, sprint. Now, the next burnout proofing protocol is to disarm the burnout triggers themselves. To diffuse burnout, detect and disarm each of the 6 triggers. Rank the 6 burnout triggers based on whatever is causing your existing burnout, or whichever poses the highest risk. Then tackle the triggers in order. Systematically address what's causing each trigger and solve the root issue. Now, here are some examples of how you can address each one. To solve a lack of control, focus your sense of control on the smallest part of your work that you can completely own, and also speak with your boss or team or coworkers about expanding the ownership that you can take for your work. If work overload is something you're at risk of, take some real time off. not just on the weekends. Also, get some active recovery in during your time off. We'll cover how to do this in a minute. It's a way to physiologically buffer yourself in a way that makes burnout nearly impossible. To beat work overload, it's not about hours off, but hours in active recovery. If insufficient reward is one of the triggers you're susceptible to, the key is to gain more by asking for more recognition, appreciation, or compensation, and to sacrifice less. Doing your work in less time being one example of how to do this. If you feel burnout from the unfairness trigger, it may stem from perceived unfairness caused by uneven, asymmetric comparisons. We tend to compare something bad about us with something good about others, but we rarely do the opposite, which skews the reality. So reset your perspective by considering the full context. And if there's actual unfairness present, address it directly with whomever is at the cause of that unfairness in the first place. If it's the values conflict burnout trigger you're getting pinned down by, then pin down your company's core values and contrast them with your own. If your values clash significantly with the company's, you might want to leave or consider a fundamentally new role. If the disconnect is minor, maybe you can negotiate a transfer to a team or role that better aligns with your values. For breakdown of community, rebuild your sense of belonging by investing regular quality time with your team. Synchronize frequently, ideally in person, to make space in meetings for members to share personal and professional victories and express genuine appreciation. It can take time to address each burnout trigger, but until these are addressed, the burnout will not let up. Now, the fifth and final protocol is to build your burnout body armor. You can prevent burnout altogether by burnout proofing your body, and as a result, your mind. The way to do this is through recovery, and not just any recovery, but what's called active recovery. Active recovery is like the on-off switch to our nervous system that most professionals dream of but never find access to. Active recovery is also the best way to address the burnout trigger, work overload, because it's not just time off of work that you need, it's active recovery within that time off. In particular, we want to use what are called hormetic stressors. Hormetic stressors jack up your heart rate in the moment, then result in it dropping over time with your heart rate variability, a great marker of recovery, elevating afterward. This is a sign of your rest and digest parasympathetic nervous system kicking in, which effectively lowers long-term stress. Think of it kind of like an Ironman suit. Hormetic stressors won't make you invulnerable, but they'll lessen the impact of burnout. In burnout, your autonomic nervous system is stuck in overdrive, like a car revving in fifth gear. Hormetic stressors temporarily slam the gear shift from fifth to sixth. This jacks up your autonomic nervous system to full sympathetic mode. This causes a parasympathetic rebound. The gear shifts back down, and the stress is now below the level of burnout. You're in second gear instead of being in fifth gear. When you're battling burnout, your nervous system is too overtaxed to even respond to meditation or maybe going for a walk in nature. These activities just don't hit your physiology hard enough. However, when you sweat it out in a sauna or you jump into an ice bath, it's an all-consuming recovery. You no longer have cognitive room to pay attention to or be bothered by the burnout. And this might sound unappealing, it may seem counterintuitive, but it works. And here are the interventions in order of intensity. First off, you've got cold-induced thermogenesis, ice baths, cold showers, cold plunges. Next, we have heat therapy, exposing yourself to extreme heat through saunas, steam rooms, hot baths, even a hot shower. Then we have exercise. For workplace Olympians, moderate exercise and strength training are non-negotiable. And lastly, massage and myofascial release. Some of the world's best athletes consider massage an indispensable part of the training regimen for a reason. The bottom line for physiological burnout proofing is to use short bursts of hormetic stress to fight burnout. And if you want to make burnout almost impossible, you need to make sure every one of your intrinsic motivators are dialed up to a 10. To figure out how to do that, click on this video.